This is Dinant, in what is today Belgium. The city is bustling with people and trade, as the rich merchants go about their business, and as the busy port brings in all sorts of exotic goods from all over Europe and beyond. In the past century, Dinant has been growing at a steady pace. After all, it is one of the major cities in the region, and it is only a matter of time before the city grows to rival the biggest urban centers in northwestern Europe. So, if one thing is for sure, it's that the future is looking ever more bright for Dinant, and it seems nothing short of a disaster could change this path. This is Dinant today. With a population of around 13,000 people, it is a quiet little riverside town, popular with tourists looking for a peaceful retreat from the bustling metropolises of Western Europe. Dinant is the 231st biggest city in Belgium, and if one thing is for sure, it's that Dinant is definitely not a big place. But wait! How is this the same city we were just talking about a minute ago? It seemed like Dinant was going to be one of the biggest cities in Western Europe, but now it's nothing like it was supposed to be. What happened? Hello and welcome to this documentary on the town of Dinant. My name is Anton, and today we're gonna learn all about the rise, fall, and the revitalization of Dinant to learn how this beautiful little spot in the world came to be, as well as how single events hundreds of years in the past can create ripple effects that still affect how the world is today. And as a little bonus, I'll also throw a tour of the town at the end so that you'll be able to connect the history of Dinant to the streets and landmarks that define it today. So to understand the dramatic fall that the town would have to face, we first need to understand how Dinant came to be, and for this we need to go all the way to the beginning. Now the Meuse Valley, where the modern town of Dinant is located, has been a center for human activity for tens of thousands of years, as the river allowed for fishing opportunities and faster traversal through the countryside. However, it seems that humans weren't the only monkeys with an affinity for sharp sticks residing in the area, as there have also been several discoveries of Neanderthal fossils, such as the ones found in the nearby caves of Nolet and Tourmacrite. Beginning at around 5000 BC, the area was most likely inhabited by farmer communities belonging to the linear pottery culture, similar to the ones discussed in the Luxembourg episode. Later on, from around 3000 BC to around 2000 BC, the area would have been a part of the Seine-Oise-Marne cultural sphere of northern France and southern Belgium. However, understandably, our understanding of this period in time is blurry at best. In more recent history though, which in this case is the first millennium BC, the area began to be inhabited by Celtic tribes during the expansion of Celtic cultural influence, leading to the formation of a vast Celtic cultural area in Western Europe known as Gaul. It's hard to know for certain, but around the 1st century BC, the Meuse River and the area of modern-day Dinant was probably settled by the Gallic tribe of Atuatuki. Just like the surrounding Gallic tribes, the Atuatuki lived in fortified hilltop settlements, which the Romans referred to as oppida, and these settlements were nothing to sneeze at, as a single oppidum could often house thousands of people. Now, there's no evidence that Dinant ever had an oppidum during the Celtic period, however the Gauls did contribute to the history of the town by giving it its name. It is believed that the town's name comes from the Celtic Divonanto, meaning sacred valley, similar to the modern Welsh Nunstoiva. But all of this oppidum dwelling and valley naming fun would have to come to an end when in 58 BC the Roman general Julius Caesar decided to take advantage of all the not so free real estate in Gaul and invaded the region at the head of 4 legions. This made the Celtic tribes residing up north in Belgium very nervous, as they feared the Romans would begin jutting into their sphere of influence. As a result, many of the tribes in northern Gaul, including the Atuatuki, formed a coalition to oppose any further Roman incursions into their territories. Unfortunately for them, Caesar managed to convince the Remi, located near the middle of Belgium, to side with the Romans, creating a hole in the Belgic resistance. The other Belgic tribes tried to subdue the Remi by attacking their oppidum of Biprax, but were driven away when Caesar arrived to defend it with his legions. After this, the alliance broke up, with each tribe retreating to their own lands, but promising to come to each other's defense if the Romans were to attack one of them. However, before the tribal forces could reorganize themselves, Caesar moved on the Suessiones, Bellovaci, and Ambiani, forcing them to surrender. The Nervi, who were the most fiercely opposed to Roman rule, organized another coalition against the Romans, which also included the Atrebates, the Viromandui, and the Atuatuki. The 4 tribes then sent their forces to conduct a surprise attack on the Roman legions at the Sabus River. The Atuatuki also contributed around 19,000 men to the army. However, as their lands were located the farthest away from the battlefield, the Atuatuki forces wouldn't make it to take part in the beginning of the battle. The other 3 tribes did manage to surprise the Romans and nearly wiped them out in the ensuing battle. However, a combination of skilled leadership, the timely arrival of reinforcements, and the good old Roman determination to conquer the entire world led the Romans to turn the tide of battle and decimate the Belgic army. Hearing of this news, the Atuatuki decided to turn back and retreat to their own lands. The Romans pursued them and besieged the Atuatuki at their main oppidum, which was located perhaps at the modern-day citadel of Namur. The Atuatuki initially settled for a lengthy siege. However, the highly advanced siege technology that the Romans possessed made the Atuatuki rethink their strategy, eventually leading them to surrender the city along with their weapons to the legions. In response, Caesar decided to spare the citizens and ordered his troops to withdraw from the city to avoid looting and pillaging. However, it turns out the surrender by the Atuatuki was less of a surrender and more of a trick to get the Romans to lower their guard, as the following night the Atuatuki made a surprise attack of their own as they stormed the Roman camp using makeshift shields and weapons they had hidden away during the surrender. Unfortunately, just like the previous surprise attack by the Gauls, the Romans were able to repel the attack, slaughtering the army of Atuatuki warriors. This time Caesar felt a little less lenient and sold the remaining civilian population into slavery. So, yikes. The severely weakened Atuatuki later joined an alliance assembled by the Treveran chief Industrialization in 54 BC, following a massive Roman defeat at the hands of the Eburones, where an entire legion was wiped out. However, this was pretty much where their fortunes ended, as Industrialization was defeated shortly after, and the rebellion was violently suppressed by the Romans. And from this point, the Atuatuki basically disappear from the history books. It is likely the remaining population assimilated to the surrounding tribes, and later the incoming Romans, as their homeland and the rest of Gaul was absorbed into the Roman Republic and the Empire later on. During the Roman Empire, the Meuse River retained its role as a key trade route in northern Gaul, allowing for easier access from inland Belgae to the rest of the Roman world. Many settlements of differing sizes would have been found along this waterway throughout the Celtic and Roman periods, and it is possible that Dinant was one of them, but it's extremely hard to know for sure. Regardless, throughout the centuries, the Meuse would be the key ingredient that facilitated the growth and enrichment of the town. However, this early history of Dinant is shrouded in mystery. As centuries would pass, Rome would be replaced by the Franks, and the old pagan religions would be forgotten with the arrival of Christianity before we finally get the first written record of the town of Dinant. At the turn of the 8th century, an anonymous scholar in Ravenna, Italy, created the Ravenna Cosmography, a series of 5 books describing the extent of the known world at the time, from Ireland all the way to India. More importantly for us though, the author created a catalog of over 5,000 ancient place names, and one of the places mentioned is a certain town of Dinantis, suggesting that the town was already well established and known to the outside world at the end of the 7th century. There are also historical sources claiming that Saint Monulf, the bishop of Tongeren and Maastricht, was born in Dinant around the early 6th century. However, these sources were written centuries after the fact, and likely are an attempt by later Dinantais to increase their prestige by creating an association to the saint. Another bishop saint, this time from the 7th century, by the name of Saint Perpet, was also said to have been born in Dinant. However, just like Monulf, his life was only chronicled centuries after his death, and thus everything we know about his life is largely legendary. According to tradition, Saint Perpet chose Dinant as his episcopal residence and founded the Church of Saint Vincent in the town, where he is said to have been buried following his death in the early 7th century. His remains were later moved to the Collegiate Church of Our Lady, where there is a shrine dedicated to him, as he is now commemorated as the patron and the protector saint of the town of Dinant. More recently, in just the last couple of years, from 2019 to 2021, the remains were analyzed by researchers from the University of Liège, who confirmed that the bones belonged to an older male from around the early 7th century. Additionally, the bones showed signs of early medieval embalming, suggesting an elevated social status. These findings support the likelihood that Saint Perpet was a real historic figure in 7th century Dinant. However, without any contemporary written sources, the legends surrounding him remain unverified. So far we've established that there was a town by the name of Dinant by the beginning of the 8th century, and likely at least a few centuries before that, if not even during the Roman and Celtic periods. But what was Dinant like at this time? Well, just like we've discussed so far, this period of Dinant history is shrouded in mystery, but considering its mention in the Ravenna cosmography, it seemed to have been a somewhat established settlement already. The rocky outcrop where the modern citadel of Dinant is located would have been a strategic point for controlling trade on the Meuse River, although there is no evidence of stone fortifications dating back to this time. The Meuse Valley was populated by small farming hamlets and occasional market points, and Dinant would have most likely been one of these little villages. The economy would have most likely been based around agriculture, fishing, and river transport, and if we were to believe the stories of Saint Monulf and Saint Perpet, even partially, the town seemed to have had some significance as a religious center as well. The Frankish kingdom split in 843 following a brief civil war, when a treaty was signed by the grandsons of Charlemagne upstream from Dinant at the town of Verdun. Dinant then passed on to the kingdom of Middle Francia, and later the kingdom of Lotharingia, before being taken over by the kingdom of West Francia, aka France. During this time, the town was a part of the Pacus of L'Homme, possibly administered from the city of Namur, about 27 kilometers downstream from Dinant. The town itself was growing in importance in the 9th century, however, as a charter in the year 824 from the Abbey of Stavel at Malmedy mentions a settlement called Dinanti that had a public bridge and that facilitated trade on the Meuse, implying the existence of a market or toll point in Dinant. Additionally, coins from the reign of Charles the Bald bear the inscription En Vico Dinant, which is believed to reference a coin mint located in the town. Eventually, after 60 years of flip-flopping between East and West Francia, the now Duchy of Lotharingia was finally taken over for good by the King of East Francia. This would begin the nearly 1,000-year-long part of history where Dinant was under the sovereignty of the kings of East Francia, who would later name themselves the Holy Roman Emperors. Dinant itself at this time was being disputed over by the new county of Namur and the Prince-Bishopric of Liège, eventually prompting the Emperor Henry IV to intervene, who sided with the Prince-Bishop, giving him almost complete control over the territory. From here, Dinant became one of the Prince-Bishopric's 23 bonnes villes, or principal cities, all the way up to the French Revolution over 700 years later. This in turn gave some much needed stability to Dinant, allowing for the town to begin prospering in the next few centuries. As one of the principal cities of the Prince-Bishopric of Liège, Dinant was granted special economic privileges and a degree of autonomy. This, coupled with the fact that the surrounding region was rich in metal ores like copper and zinc, and perhaps even the town's previous experience in coin minting, allowed Dinant to begin specializing in the metalworking industry. The town especially focused on brass production, using the Meuse to export brass objects like ornaments and liturgical items to the rest of Europe. By the late Middle Ages, Dinant had established a strong reputation as one of the major centers for brasswork in all of Europe, with the term dinanderie beginning to be used to describe the highly sought-after brass objects created in the town. And even today, the term dinandier in French refers to a craftsman who makes hammered decorative or utilitarian objects from copper, brass, or other similar metals. It could be said that between the early 12th century and the middle of the 15th century, Dinant had one of the highest concentrations of skilled brass workers in the entire world. In turn, all of this international trade made the town fabulously wealthy and even earned it a membership in the Hanseatic League. Unlike today, Dinant in the High Middle Ages would have been one of the major cities in the region, with probable estimates ranging from just below 10,000 inhabitants all the way up to 30,000, which is pretty striking considering that the town has a population of 13,000 today. And thanks to its economic agility, Dinant was able to recover relatively quickly from the Black Death, which killed approximately half of the town's and Europe's populations in the 1340s and 50s, once again showing how the town's strategic location on the river and its crafts industry were what allowed Dinant to become and stay so prosperous over centuries. At the same time as Dinant was growing in wealth, population, and prosperity, the town began growing physically as well, as a swath of construction projects rapidly developed what used to be a small village on the Meuse. The Prince-Bishop ordered the construction of the town's first stone bridge to replace the earlier wooden bridge that had connected the town to the other side of the river. The first citadel on the rocky outcrop overlooking the city was also finished around the year 1080, and to accompany it, a Romanesque church was built at the foot of the promontory. And even though none of these buildings have survived to this day, it's crazy to think how the town's iconic riverfront panorama of the bridge, the church, and the castle has been around for nearly 1,000 years. The Romanesque church was later destroyed when a section of the promontory fell right on top of it, requiring for a new church to be constructed, which they decided to do in the exact same spot. But hey, I guess just like the old saying goes, a massive section of rock from a cliff face never destroys the same church twice. The Collégiale Notre-Dame, or the Collegiate Church of Our Lady, was built in the Gothic style this time, influenced by similar churches in Burgundy and Champagne. And although it has been damaged and restored several times in its 800-year-long history, this is the very same church that still overlooks the river in Dinant today. Additionally, in 1152, an abbey was constructed in the nearby village of Lef, with it playing a central role in the town's religious life to this day. In the year 1240, the monks in the abbey also began brewing ale, as was common for European monasteries at the time. Now you might have already recognized the name Lef, as the monastery's brewery would later be bought in the 1950s by the Interwar company, who in turn created the beer brand Lef, one of the most famous Belgian beer brands in the world. So this beer cost me nearly €4, which is quite the investment, but it's got subtle nuances of vanilla, at least I assume, I didn't actually check, and a clue of giraffe. That one I'm not sure of. And it's got a strong taste. It's definitely not for everyone. Yes, this is a beer review channel now. And I know it's not the same recipe anymore, but honestly, all I gotta say is thank you, you random 13th century monks from Belgium, for this absolutely banger of a drink. Anyway, where were we? Oh, right. All in all, the High Middle Ages were a time of rapid growth in the town. However, although the town's great location was probably its greatest asset, it also might have been its greatest downfall. In many ways, Dinant was a frontier town, with the Meuse Valley being located in the border region between the Germanic East and the Latin West. Its location on the far western edge of the Holy Roman Empire made the town vulnerable in the geopolitical rivalry between the HRE and the Kingdom of France. And even more locally, Dinant got itself entangled in the rivalry between the Prince-Bishopric of Liège and the county of Namur, just on the other side of the river, and the Duchy of Brabant, around the city of Brussels. The Liégeois-Brabantian War started in the year 1202, and would continue on and off for the next nearly 2 centuries. Luckily for Dinant though, there doesn't seem to be any record of fighting taking place in the town during these conflicts, but the town would have been required to contribute men, arms, and financial support to the Prince-Bishop. On the other hand, the wars with the county of Namur hit a bit closer to home for the Dinantais, as the River Meuse roughly marked the border between the two territories. Additionally, Dinant had its own rivalry with the town of Bouvigny, just barely a kilometer downstream on the Namur side of the river. The two towns competed fiercely economically, as both towns had large artisanal and metalworking industries, although it seems Dinant always had the upper hand in this rivalry and had a larger population. Regardless, the centuries-long feud between the two towns led to a deep resentment from the citizens of both towards each other. So whenever their feudal lords in Liège and Namur fought wars for regional dominance, the two towns would often take the opportunity to take jabs at each other as well. The first notable war between the Prince-Bishopric and the county happened in 1275 with the War of the Cow. I kid you not, that's actually its name. The war started when a peasant stole a cow during a jousting tournament in the Belleville of Sine. The thief was caught, but the bailiff agreed to let him live if he returned the cow to its rightful owner. However, this seemingly mundane day in the world of medieval law enforcement turned a lot more complicated in the dumbest way imaginable, when the bailiff's men either misunderstood their orders or were high on a power trip and executed the peasant regardless. Now the peasant was under the authority of the Lord of Guen, another vassal of the Prince-Bishop, who wasn't super happy that his peasant had been killed off unjustly without consulting him first, and retaliated by launching a military offensive against Sine, who in turn retaliated by launching a military offensive against Guen, who retaliated even further by allying with his own lord's enemies Namur, Brabant, and Luxembourg. At this point, this petty dispute turned into a full-blown war, when the neighboring fiefdoms took the opportunity to invade the Prince-Bishopric. And while all of this was happening, the Prince-Bishop was too afraid to escalate the conflict further, even though the enemy armies were already laying waste to the countryside and sacked the city of Sine. The people in Liège revolted and had the Prince-Bishop replaced with a new one, who was way more aggressive against the invaders, and assembled the Prince-Bishopric's vassals for a counterattack. Notably, Dinant was tasked with attacking the village of Spontan, which they sacked in 1276. The next year, the Dinantais most likely also participated in the Battle of Lavard-de-Steppe, when the Liégeois army defeated the county of Namur. The war would last until 1278, when, after years of fighting, scorched villages and towns, and estimated casualties numbering in the tens of thousands, the two sides finally asked the King of France to make an arbitration to end the war. The king then made the decision to restore the status quo that had existed before. So in other words, this ridiculous war with a ridiculous name, fought for ridiculous reasons, was genuinely completely pointless. This is exactly the kind of medieval nonsense that makes you laugh out loud before giving you crippling existential dread for humanity. Following the war, the rivalry between Dinant and Bovigny intensified over the course of the next few decades, as Bovigny sought to challenge Dinant's economic and metalworking dominance. The tensions escalated into a war between the two towns in 1319, when Dinant marched its militia to lay siege to Bovigny. The Bovinois managed to resist the attack, however, and the Dinantais had to return to the right bank of the river, where they constructed a watchtower called the Montergay to watch over and threaten Bovigny. The next 3 years then saw the two rivals attack each other sporadically, with neither side seeing much success. The war came to an end in 1322, likely through a settlement between the Prince-Bishop and the Count of Namur, after which the two towns shifted to continue their feud exclusively in economics and politics. For a little while at least. But although as a vassal of the Prince-Bishopric, Dinant often took its side in conflicts, the town's relationship with Liège wasn't always the best. For example, there was a revolt in the town in 1231 when the Prince-Bishop tried to limit Dinant's precious economic privileges. Eventually, the Prince-Bishop budged and agreed to grant legal recognition of civic and economic rights in the town. However, when he later again tried to remove the legally protected rights, the Dinantais once again rose up in revolt, although it's unclear how successful this one was. The struggle between the Prince-Bishop's authority and the rights and liberties of the principal cities would continue on and off for centuries, with the Bonneville rising up in revolt against the Prince-Bishop, who would then grant the cities with certain liberties, only to then try to repeal said liberties, which would then cause the cities to rise up in revolt. Rinse and repeat. A particularly gruesome chapter happened in 1406, when the nobles and burghers of the Prince-Bishopric revolted against the authoritarian rule of the Prince-Bishop John of Bavaria. The Dinantais, ever so ready to defend their autonomy, joined in and captured the castle of Bouillon from the Prince-Bishop. Unfortunately for the rebels, John of Bavaria came from an extremely powerful regional family, who came to his aid and eradicated the rebels at the Battle of Otte in 1408, although it's unclear if Dinant participated in the battle. Following the defeat, the rebel cities, including Dinant, were punished harshly by John, who gained himself the nickname the Pitiless. The Dinantais were able to lift off some of the punishments imposed on them, however, with the support of King Sigismund, but the event still signaled a shift in the Prince-Bishop's favor for the foreseeable future. And this was the extremely complicated relationship the town of Dinant had with its overlords in Liège. One year they could be fighting alongside them against the neighboring Namur, Brabant and Luxembourg, and the next they could be in open revolt against their Prince-Bishop. Medieval feudal Europe was an impossibly complex system of networks between different localities working mostly in their own self-interest. Two places could have a hierarchical relationship with each other, be allies, be enemies, or be all three things at the same time. And you'd be hard-pressed to find a place where this was exemplified as clearly as Dinant. Officially, Dinant was a vassal of the Prince-Bishopric. However, depending on the time, it had a certain level of autonomy, and for example was independently part of the Hanseatic League, even conducting international trade on its own. Even militarily, it could either join the Prince-Bishopric's other militias and fight for Liège, join the other militias to fight against Liège, or fight independently against its own local rivals. And I think this gives a more meaningful insight into what the medieval European world was like, more than any map like this or this could ever teach us. But back to the main topic of the video. By all accounts, the period between the early 11th century and the middle of the 15th century was the golden age of the town of Dinant, thanks to its unbeatable reputation in brassworking, its economic prosperity and political influence. By many metrics, Dinant was one of the major cities in what we today call Belgium, which begs the question, why is it that if you today go read the list of the biggest cities in Belgium, the town doesn't even break the top 50? Well, it turns out that Dinant's age of prosperity, as well as all of its future potential, would come to a tragic end in the 15th century. The beginning of the end for Dinant was marked by the arrival of a new expanding power in the region, the Duchy of Burgundy. In 1384, the Duke of Burgundy came into an enormous inheritance of territory in the Low Countries through his wife's father, the Count of Flanders. From here, the Dukes of Burgundy set off on a nearly century-long campaign to consolidate all of the fiefdoms in the Low Countries under their control. A problem for them, however, was that the Prince-Bishopric was an ecclesiastical territory of the Holy Roman Empire, where the ruler was appointed by the Pope, and therefore the dukes couldn't directly acquire it as a hereditary fiefdom. The next best thing was to subject the Prince-Bishop under heavy Burgundian influence, giving the Duke de facto rule over the territory. Remember Prince-Bishop John of Bavaria from the 1406 revolt? Well, in 1385, his sister was married to the soon-to-be Duke of Burgundy, John the Fearless, making them in-laws. And in 1406, when the rebels tried to dethrone Bishop John, it was Duke John who came to his rescue, leading the anti-rebel forces to a decisive victory at the Battle of Otte. As one of the main cities in the revolt, the two Johns wanted to give a harsh punishment to Dinant and strip the city of many of its rights and privileges and ordered it to dismantle its fortifications. The Dinant partially complied with the orders by dismantling the Muntugay Tower. However, they then went behind the Duke and Prince Bishop's backs and snitched to the king, who declared the orders to be illegal as they were attempted to be enforced on imperial territory. With this little trick, Dinant managed to save itself for the time being, but in the process had made itself a very powerful enemy. In 1429, Duke Philip the Good took control of the Prince-Bishoprics and Dinant's ancient rival of the county of Namur, bringing the Burgundians right up to Dinant's doorstep. In response, the Dinant reconstructed the Montorgueil and reinforced the city's defensive walls, and they were right to do so, as Duke Philip immediately sent out an expedition to avenge his late father's humiliation and destroy Dinant. However, the Dinant were able to repel the attackers and hung the siege ladders inside the collegiate church as trophies. In response, the principal cities of the Prince-Bishopric pressured the Prince Bishop to declare war on the Burgundians, and in the resulting conflict, the Liégeois laid waste to the Namurian countryside, with Dinant once again sieging Bouvigny. However, the Burgundians were also able to repel the attackers, and eventually defeated the Liégeois, forcing them to pay heavy reparations for the damage they had done. Dinant was once again ordered to destroy the Montorgueil. However, the stubborn Dinant refused to do so. This didn't please Duke Philip, whose hatred for the town would only grow deeper as he vowed he would do whatever it takes to make them pay. In 1464, the Duke had become an old man and named his son Charles as his lieutenant general, functionally giving the reins of the duchy and its large land empire to the 31-year-old. Charles, who would later gain the nickname the Bold, wasted no time in starting a war with the King of France, with the two sides meeting for a battle near Paris. The battle, however, ended in a draw, leading King Louis XI to send envoys to the Prince-Bishopric of Liège in order to gain allies. Many of the principal cities of the Prince-Bishopric, including Dinant, jumped at the opportunity to strike a blow against their regional rival the Burgundians, with the Dinant crossing the Meuse River to lay waste to the countryside surrounding Bouvigny. Around August 1st, 1465, being sure of the King of France's victory over the Burgundians, the townsfolk set up on the right bank across the river from Bouvigny to make a mockery out of the Burgundian rulers. They reportedly paraded a mannequin representing Lieutenant General Charles wearing a cowbell around his neck. The Dinant then hanged the mannequin, shot arrows at it, and called the Burgundian ruler a bastard, who was born after his mother cheated on his father. And this is how Twitter was born. Unfortunately for the Dinant, the King of France didn't manage to defeat the Burgundians, who instead forced him to sign a peace treaty that heavily favored the Burgundians and their allies. Even worse for them was that the peace treaty didn't include the Prince-Bishopric, which meant that the Burgundians would be coming to settle unfinished business there next. The armies of Burgundy and Liège met for a battle near the village of Montenacan, where the much larger Liégeois force would decide the future of Liège and Dinant against the mighty Burgundian state. So when the Liégeois were decimated at the battle, leaving the rest of the Prince-Bishopric virtually defenseless, the city of Dinant was engulfed in panic and chaos. No one knew what was going to happen once the Burgundians reached the city walls, if the city was going to be sacked, or if it was going to be spared. For most townspeople, leaving the city would have meant leaving behind everything that they owned, most likely condemning themselves to become vagabonds for the rest of their lives. And that's if the surrounding towns were even willing to take in refugees. Even the richer citizens couldn't leave, as their livelihoods were tied down to their forges and heavy equipment, which they simply could not just take with them. The townspeople were essentially trapped in Dinant, waiting to see what was going to happen to them and their families. Things got even worse when the Burgundians signed a peace treaty with Liège, this time specifically excluding the city of Dinant. It was becoming clear that the Dukes of Burgundy were finally going to have their revenge on the town. In August of the year 1466, Charles left Namur at the head of an army of around 30,000 men, which was an absolutely enormous army at the time, especially for a siege against a town the size of Dinant. Charles eventually grew impatient and led a contingent of 300 knights to reach Dinant as quickly as possible. They arrived in Lef, where they drove the inhabitants away and set up quarters at the Lef Abbey. The next day, the rest of the army caught up and set up for a siege around the town, and despite being severely weakened by illness, Duke Philip arrived by boat to Bouvigny to witness his son finally take revenge on the city that he despised. The Burgundians began the siege by bombarding the city walls, and despite being heavily outnumbered, the Dinant hoped that the other cities in the Prince-Bishopric, or even the King of France, would regroup and come to their aid. The Burgundians sent 2 messengers from Bouvigny to deliver the terms of surrender to the Dinant, which I'm sure you realize by this point how offensive that must have been to the immensely prideful Dinant, who unsurprisingly executed the 2 messengers. The Burgundians then continued their bombardment. However, confident in the arrival of reinforcements, the Dinant refused to surrender, and instead they placed a mannequin representing a woman atop the ramparts with a spinning wheel bearing the inscription, "When this woman spins, Philip will have this city." No, I don't know what their thing with mannequins is. The bombardment continued for a few days until August 22nd, when the artillery managed to create a breach in the northern wall. Recognizing that their time might be up, the Dinant tried to sue for peace, but Duke Philip's terms were so harsh that they decided it was better to keep fighting. The Burgundians, who themselves were worried that the reinforcements could be arriving soon, started to prepare for an assault on the city as soon as possible. The assault was set to begin on the 25th of August, when the Dinant, realizing that they were doomed either way, accepted an unconditional surrender. Charles made his triumphant entry into the conquered city the following day, with his entourage proudly displaying Burgundy's coat of arms. However, this would only be the beginning of Dinant's troubles. On August 27th, Charles set the terms to his soldiers on pillaging the city. The pillage was to last 2 days, beginning the next day on August 28th. However, the pillaging actually began chaotically that same evening, as the impatient soldiers became uncontrollable, although Charles ordered some of the soldiers guilty of crimes against women to be executed. Deadly fights also broke out in the streets between troops that tried to steal each other's loot. The next morning, the women, children, and the clergy of the city were evacuated, as it was a common Burgundian practice before a pillaging was to take place. The city elites were imprisoned, and their families were held down for ransom. Meanwhile, the city's artillery officer and the citizens involved in the first mannequin episode were sought out and executed. With these things out of the way, the pillaging of the city could begin. Officially this time. Over the next 2 days, all of the city's wealth that hadn't already been taken during the unofficial pillage was stripped from the city by the rampaging soldiers. Much of the city was destroyed, including the collegiate church and the citadel and the promontory, although this was nothing compared to what the citizens who were still left in Dinant would have to face. On the second day of the pillaging, August 29th, the Burgundians shifted their focus to quelling any rebellious aspirations that the other cities in the regions might have had by making an example out of the Dinant. Around 800 of the townsfolk were gathered up at the riverfront and tied in pairs, after which each pair was taken out to the middle of the river where they could confess their sins while facing the town of Bovigny before the boat was overturned, plunging the victims into their watery grave. That night, the city was set on fire, probably by accident, forcing the troops to leave the city in haste. The city, with its timber-framed townhouses, quickly turned into a massive blaze, destroying virtually all of the once prosperous city. Now, Duke Philip had not forgotten how the Dinant had disobeyed his father's orders to dismantle the city's fortifications back in 1408, or his own orders to destroy the Montorgueil in the 1430s, and ordered Dinant's fortifications to be demolished once and for all. The city walls and defensive towers were dismantled over the course of the next year, after which the Dinant were formally forbidden from rebuilding them by the Burgundian authorities. The city's remaining brass workers that had survived the siege and the sack of the city were invited to settle in Namur, as their skills were still valuable, and Dinant wasn't much used to, well, anyone. The first sack of Dinant was one of the most brutal urban destructions in medieval European history. The amount of cultural and human loss is incomprehensible, and some of the events that happened during this episode really highlight the extent of human cruelty. Dinant was one of the proudest and most prosperous cities in its region, and by many metrics, the city would never recover. Dinant's brassworking industry would never reach anywhere near the same heights it had had in the previous centuries. The city's commercial prestige would be gone forever, and depending on what estimates you consider to be the most likely, it's possible that the population still to this day has not recovered. But this wasn't the end for Dinant's dramatic story, as the town would still have to face many challenges, with no guarantee that it would survive to our day. Over the next few decades, the town began to slowly rebuild as the surviving townspeople began repairing their homes, the few remaining brass workers returned to their forges, and the monks from the Left Abbey worked to re-establish religious life in the sacked city. The city walls could only begin to be restored after Charles's death in 1477, as it led the House of Burgundy into a succession crisis that would eventually put an end to the Burgundian state. The Burgundian Netherlands was taken over by Charles's grandson, Philip of Habsburg, with whom most of the Low Countries would come under Habsburg control for the next 300 years. For the Prince Bishopric though, it was meet the new boss, same as the old boss, as the Burgundian influence in their internal affairs was simply replaced by Habsburg influence this time. So although the Prince Bishopric had technically stayed an autonomous part of the Holy Roman Empire throughout this whole time, by this point it had practically become a client state of the Habsburgs. The Habsburg overlords didn't have much of an interest in Dinant's economic recovery, and were instead mainly focused on using the castle to control trade on the Meuse. Regardless, the town continued to rebuild and recover, and life would slowly return back to normal in the decades following the sack, even if the town never got anywhere near its former glory. But I guess on the positive side, now that they were more irrelevant than before, surely they were going to be less of a target for the bigger powers in the region than before, right? Wrong. Now, the thing about having a prime location on an easily navigable trade route like the Meuse is that it's kind of a double-edged sword. Now, of course, it can be immensely helpful for trade, as it makes transporting goods along it relatively easy. However, on the other hand, this also makes it extremely likely to be used by any invading army marching through the countryside, along with their violent, pillaging, each other murdering soldiers. So, if the Dinantais had gotten to enjoy the good parts of their location for the past 500 years, now they were going to experience the bad parts for the next 500 years. Philip of Habsburg eventually handed the Low Countries to his son, Charles, who in addition to being the Lord of the Netherlands, held an array of other influential titles. Most notably, he was also the Holy Roman Emperor and the King of Spain. This in turn made him the main geopolitical rival of the King of France, with the two fighting it out for European dominance several times during the Italian Wars. And during the creatively named Italian War of 1551 to 1559, the French launched an offensive into the Habsburg-controlled Low Countries, and like you might have already guessed, the Meuse Valley was their chosen path up country. Bovigny was captured by French troops in July of 1554, and although the Dinantais might have been glad to see their ancient rivals get their comeuppance, the so-called rivalry at this point had become more of a pathetic grudge between two irrelevant villages, and worse yet, it didn't take a genius to figure out that the French might want to come take the Habsburg-controlled castle in Dinant next. The town was easily overrun by the French, who began besieging the castle and the promontory. The fortress resisted against the French onslaught under the leadership of the famous Spanish captain Julian Romero. Eventually, for the Spanish though, the defense became impossible to maintain, and the captain negotiated the surrender of the castle in exchange for his and his men's lives. Dinant would be under military occupation for the next 5 years, while the French and the Spanish were fighting it out in the Low Countries. During the occupation, the French army needed a lot of resources to maintain their war efforts, leading a lot of the food produced in the area to be requisitioned by the French, which in turn then led to food shortages in Dinant and the surrounding area. The resulting hunger weakened the citizens' immune systems, which combined with large movements of foreign troops through the town, many of whom were quartered in civilian homes, likely led to frequent outbreaks of disease. The war would be ended by the Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis, which returned Dinant and the other towns conquered by France in the Meuse Valley back to Spain. Although absolutely nothing compared to the sacking the town had endured less than 100 years ago, the siege and the military occupation by the French had caused significant damage to Dinant and its already frail economy. The collegiate church, for example, had been severely damaged, and it was probably during its restoration following the French occupation that the church's distinctive pear-shaped bell tower was constructed, creating the now iconic facade of the building. Things weren't great in Dinant, but they weren't exactly terrible either, and even with occasional passing of Spanish troops through the town during the Dutch revolt, the Dinantais got to enjoy over 100 years of peace. Now, this period of moderately good times came to an end in 1672, when France decided to conquer the new Dutch Republic and launched an invasion that nearly reached Amsterdam before the Dutch used their waterbending abilities and flooded the land ahead of the French army. The Habsburgs realized that the fall of the Dutch Republic would be pretty bad for their own territorial ambitions and quickly came to the Republic's aid, forcing the French to give up their invasion. France, now angry at having its prize yoinked from it, shifted its focus to attacking the Habsburg possessions around its borders. And although Dinant and the Prince-Bishopric of Liège officially remained neutral during this conflict, the Emperor had stationed a German garrison at the castle, making the town a probable target for the French. And in the spring of 1675, the French once again arrived in the Meuse Valley to lay siege to Dinant. The French general first sent out feint attacks on Namur and Charleroi to prevent their garrisons to come into Dinant's aid. The main French force then moved on to besiege Dinant, and just like last time, the town was overrun relatively quickly, after which the French began besieging the German force in the castle. The Duke of Lorraine, upon hearing of the siege, quickly raced to help out the Germans. However, he couldn't make it on time as the castle fell only 4 days later. And so, the town was once again under French military control. King Louis XIV himself entered the conquered town in the spring of 1675 and ordered the towns and the citadel's fortifications to be renovated by the French military engineer Sébastien de Prest, Marquis of Vapon, who was also later famously responsible for carrying out the modernization of the fortifications of Luxembourg City. And with its brand new and modern fortifications, Dinant briefly became the headquarters of King Louis and his royal court, while he personally oversaw the siege of Namur in 1692. So, in other words, if you squint your eyes, don't think about it too much, and are also kinda drunk, you could say that for a few months, Dinant was technically the capital of France. Dinant would stay under French occupation until the Treaty of Ryswick, when the borders between the warring nations were returned to essentially what they were before the war, with Dinant returning to the Prince-Bishopric of Liège. However, it was also agreed that the new fortifications in Dinant were to be dismantled, so the town didn't even get to keep those. Thankfully though, the French would surely not try to take the town again. In the year 1700, King Charles II of Spain pulled a prank on all of Europe and died without an heir. To the other royals in Europe, this meant a yard sale on all of this now free real estate, and soon Western Europe was engulfed in another massive war. The French immediately went back to their favorite pastime and took over Dinant. They swear they're not addicted, they can stop whenever they want. As a strategically important location along the Meuse, the town was once again crucial for the maintenance of French supply lines in the region, and the Dinantais would once again have to suffer from food shortages and quartering of troops during yet another military occupation. However, this one would be relatively short-lived, as only around 2 years later in 1703, the town was taken back by Habsburg and Dutch troops. The war, however, would continue to rage on until 1713, when a series of treaties restored the pre-war borders in the Low Countries, giving Dinant once again back to the Prince Bishopric. The only difference was that this time, the Spanish Habsburg viceroys in Brussels, who had been influencing the politics of the Prince Bishopric for the past 1.5 centuries, had now been replaced by Austrian Habsburg viceroys, who would carry on with this practice. For Dinant, this part of their history was especially frustrating, as they were stuck in a loop of going through wars and occupations, followed by only short periods of peace. This turbulent period wasn't great for the town's economy, which was modest at best, although it still benefited from the trade flowing through the river. On a positive note though, it's likely that during this time, one of the staples of Dinantais culture, the coq de Dinant or the Dinant cake, was invented. This pastry is an extremely hard, sweet biscuit made from only 2 ingredients, wheat flour and honey, in equal amounts by weight. This simple but unique composition gives the biscuit its remarkable hardness, but also allows for it to be preserved for a very long time. These biscuits come in a wide range in sizes and are usually baked into elaborate shapes, ranging from flowers to animals to landscapes and other works of art. It's likely the economic hardships faced during this period of the town's history forced the Dinantais to innovate with the ingredients they had at their disposal, while also creating a need for foods that could be preserved for a long time during economic hardships, or, for example, during a siege. The biscuit was probably inspired by hardtack, a type of salty biscuit given to sailors, such as the tradesmen sailing the Meuse River, which was similarly hard and long-lasting. It may be that the confluence of these factors led the Dinantais to create this simple, yet tasty, and long-lasting treat, which became a symbol of the beauty and the resilience of the town itself. To this day, the biscuit remains a popular treat in the town, especially on St. Nicholas Day in December. The biscuit was also later modified in the 19th century when a Dinantais baker called Jean-François Rance wanted to make the texture softer and easier to eat. He did this by adding sugar into the mix, which also made the pastry even sweeter. This variant became then aptly known as the coq de Rance, or Rance's cake. There is also a local legend that pushes the biscuit's origin back even further to the siege of Dinant in 1466. According to the legend, the starving Dinantais had little provisions left besides flour and honey, causing them to improvise a dough out of these 2 ingredients. The citizens then used molds meant for decorative brassworks to create patterns on the biscuits, beginning the tradition of giving them elaborate shapes. Although this story is unlikely, as the first evidence we have of these biscuits only go back to the 18th century, while no such evidence has been found dating back to the siege. It would have also been unlikely that the citizens would have been left with nothing but flour and honey, as honey was expensive and thus stored in smaller amounts. Let me also remind you that the Dinantais had a full year to prepare for the siege, as the defeat of the Liégeois army happened the previous summer, and considering the siege lasted for only about a week, it's even unlikely that the town had enough time to run out of their stockpiles of food at all. And lastly, this story is just a little too neat, as it connects the origin story of the town's most famous culinary item to its famous brassworking industry in the backdrop of the town's most famous historical event. But anyway, returning to 18th century Dinant from my way too elaborate tangent on local cookies, let's see how our favorite biscuit baking Belgian town is doing. All I did was look away for 2 minutes. So to explain what was going on, we need to travel in time to the year 1789, where we find the Prince Bishopric of Liège in political turmoil. Now you probably don't need me to remind you that the Prince Bishopric was ruled by the Prince Bishop, who is both the Catholic Bishop of the Diocese of Liège and the ruler of the Imperial Estate of Liège. And as we've seen throughout this video, the Prince Bishop wasn't always super well liked by the people of the Prince Bishopric. Dinant itself had also had its own history of friction with the Prince Bishops, going back centuries to the first revolts for economic rights in the Middle Ages. This ancient feud between the Prince Bishop and the people would once again flare up in the late 1780s, however this time would be fundamentally different. See, in 1784, the widely popular Prince Bishop François Charles de Felbrouck, who had been championing the ideas of the Enlightenment, died, leading to the election of César Constantin François de Hunsbroek as the Prince Bishop. How anyone's supposed to pronounce that name is beyond me. Unlike his predecessor, Innsbruck was much more authoritarian and immediately began undoing the progressive reforms that Felbrook had introduced. This, coupled with the popularization of Enlightenment age ideas, made him really unpopular with the poverty-stricken people of the Prince Bishopric. The tensions began to slowly boil over the next few years, to the point where the people needed just a little push to take them over the edge. And that push came in the year 1789. On July 14th, the people in Paris, similarly disillusioned with their leadership, stormed the Bastille, beginning the French Revolution. Encouraged by this development, the revolutionaries in Liège stormed the city's citadel and the Prince Bishop's summer residence, forcing Innsbruck to accept their revolutionary demands. The Liégeois then declared the transition of the Prince Bishopric into a republic, although Innsbruck managed to escape to Trier before this. Dinant didn't have much to do with the revolution or the creation of the republic. However, the town chose to support the revolution, partly because they had grown tired of the heavy taxation and duties imposed on them by the upper classes, but also because they didn't want to brand themselves as anti-revolutionaries in the eyes of the often violent radicals. Unfortunately for the young republic, Prussia and Austria quickly came to the Prince Bishop's aid, crushing the rebellion in early 1791 and restoring the old Prince Bishopric. The pro-revolutionaries that hadn't fled to France were severely punished, gaining Innsbruck the nickname Red Executioner. He died the next year in 1792, holding on to power to his last breath. However, his successor would not get to do the same. In 1792, France invaded the Austrian Netherlands, getting a major victory over the Austrians near the city of Mons, from where the army headed to capture the cities of Namur and Liège. It's likely that during the siege of Namur, some French troops passed through Dinant, although it doesn't seem that there was any siege of the town itself. By late November, the French had managed to capture Liège, where they were enthusiastically received by the local revolutionaries. The French occupiers organized a vote for Liège to join the French Republic, in which the Liégeois reportedly overwhelmingly voted in favor of the annexation. And although I couldn't find any source claiming that a similar vote took place in Dinant as well, it's likely that there was one in the town. And considering the French military presence, along with the fact that these votes were cast openly by voice, it's also likely that Dinant voted in favor of the annexation as well. It's also worth noting that many of the opponents of the annexation in Liège preferred to abstain from the vote. Regardless, Paris was happy to quickly accept these results, adding the conquered territories to their republic. This didn't last for long, however, as the French were driven out of the Low Countries in early 1793, with the Austrians reinstating the Prince Bishop back into power. Dinant had now changed rulers 4 times in the past 4 years, and this wouldn't be the last time, as the French invaded the Low Countries again in 1794. The army groups led by General Jean-Baptiste Jourdan, not to be confused with Michael Jourdan, advanced up the Meuse River, arriving in Dinant in May of 1794. The town was once again overrun relatively quickly, allowing Jourdan to secure his supply lines for the siege of Charleroi the next month. This time, the French actually managed to keep the conquered Low Countries and decided to officially annex parts of them the next year in 1795. Dinant became a part of the newly created Department of Sambre and Meuse, administered from the city of Namur, although the town would later itself become an administrative center when it became the seat of its own subdivision of the department. Dinant even managed to hold 2 elections for sub-prefect before, spoiler alert, the First French Empire was defeated. Dinant's brief time under the French First Republic and later the First French Empire was characterized by deep political, social, and economic changes the likes of which hadn't been seen in the town for centuries. The Napoleonic Civil Code was introduced throughout the French Republic in 1804, replacing local laws and customs, and introducing uniform legal principles such as equality before the law, secular marriage, and inheritance rules. To this day, the Code Civil is the basis for the current civil codes used in Belgium and other nearby countries like Luxembourg. Economically and socially, the time as part of France was quite harsh on the Dinantais. The French Republicans were very aggressive on traditional social institutions, most notably the Catholic Church, leading the period to be characterized by strict state control and religion. The French Republic and Empire was also in nearly constant state of war, and the war economy led to fluctuating prices, food shortages, and a constant military presence around the Meuse Valley. Additionally, Napoleon's continental system and trade embargo against the British Empire diminished Dinant's ability to trade with the outside world. And despite the French citizenship offering some benefits, like the ability to vote and the right to political representation, in 1798 the French Republic introduced compulsory military service in all French territories, leading many young Dinantais men to be conscripted to the French Revolutionary Army. General conscription was an unprecedented idea for the time, and was deeply unpopular popular among the people, especially in modern-day Belgium and Luxembourg, leading to armed uprisings in the region, although Dinant itself didn't participate in these. The French period in Dinant came to an end in 1814, when the French Empire was defeated and forced to surrender to the coalition of European monarchies. For the next year, the town was governed from Brussels by the Provisional Government of Belgium, while the great powers of Europe gathered in Vienna to discuss the new geopolitical system following France's defeat. But then, out of nowhere, Napoleon made a surprise comeback tour in 1815 and became the French emperor for the second time. Unfortunately for him though, he was defeated at Waterloo just under 4 months later, bringing the French Empire down for a second time. Eventually, the great powers of Europe came to an agreement on their new European political order, which included the Low Countries being amalgamated into the United Kingdom of the Netherlands. The main reason for this was that the great powers wanted to create a buffer state between France and Prussia, but secretly, they had also previously promised to award the territory of the former Dutch Republic, Austrian Netherlands, and the Prince Bishopric of Liège to Prince William of the House of Orange-Nassau. The establishment of this new country would be the beginning of the so-called Dutch period in Dinant history. In the span of little more than 20 years, the world that Dinant found itself in had completely changed. The old feudal system and the Prince Bishopric the town had existed in for pretty much its entire history had been unceremoniously wiped off from the face of the earth, and in its place a new world built on nationalist ideas would begin to form. In comparison to the decades of conflict the town had endured through, the Dutch period allowed Dinant to enjoy relative peace and stability. The unified market that stretched from the North Sea to the Ardennes benefited the town's economy, as the movement of goods was freer than it had ever been under the fragmented regimes of the past. As always, trade along the Meuse remained important, and the town's traditional industries in brassware, tanning, and the manufacture of playing cards kept going strong, although they were starting to feel the pressure from the rapid industrialization of the southern Netherlands. On the other hand, Dinant was located in the border region of a country that was created as a buffer state to limit France's territorial ambitions, and in this context, the British and the Dutch began building a barrier in the southern provinces consisting of 3 lines of fortifications, called the Wellington Barrier. The citadel of Dinant fell on the first line of these defenses, and an extensive restoration of the fortress was carried out in the late 1810s. Socially, the Dutch period in Dinant and the southern Netherlands was a time of growing tensions between the Dutch king and his administrators in the north and the increasingly dissatisfied people of the southern provinces. The rule of William I was authoritarian in nature, and even though this wasn't exclusively felt by the southerners, the political system of the kingdom was heavily skewed in favor of the north. Despite the southern provinces having a larger population, being more industrialized, and thus making up a larger portion of the country's economy, the kingdom's political, administrative, and military leadership was dominated by the northern Dutch. Tensions also simmered over religion, as the mostly Catholic South wanted to maintain Catholicism as the state religion in the South, while much of the political leadership in the mostly Protestant North, including the king himself, were in favor of the hegemony of Protestantism. Over the 15 years following the creation of the United Kingdom of the Netherlands, the people of Dinant and the rest of the South began to slowly realize the true nature of the kingdom, not that of a truly unified nation of equal parts, but a political convenience for the great European powers, given to be ruled by the Dutch king in The Hague. And unsurprisingly, it didn't take long before the tensions erupted into a full-blown rebellion, when the Belgians in Brussels, inspired by the July Revolution in France, took to the streets and gained control of key political buildings in the city. The king, on the other hand, had other ideas, and sent a cavalry force to Brussels to put an end to the revolt. Unfortunately for him though, the Brusselians managed to defeat the cavalry, forcing them to withdraw from the city. Following this victory, a group of Dinant volunteers, who had joined the revolutionaries in Brussels, returned to their hometown to spread the news on the events of the past few days. The Dinant, now once more emboldened to rise up against the people in charge, forced the garrison stationed in the town to retreat to the citadel, and in an interesting switch of roles, it was now the townsfolk who began besieging the fortress. The garrison, under the leadership of Major Jean-François Joseph de Ven, one of the rare Belgian senior officers in the army of the United Kingdom of the Netherlands, was now forced to make a decision between their loyalty to the king and firing on their own people. Like was the case with most of the rest of the kingdom's army, desertion rates among the Belgian-born enlisted soldiers would have likely been quite high. The Dinant then were joined by a volunteer force from the nearby town of Sine, and when they cut off the fortress from its supply of water, the garrison was forced to surrender. And then 2 days later, the revolutionaries in Brussels declared Belgium as an independent country and chose Leopold of the House of Saxe-Coburg as the king for the new country. For its role in the revolution, the newly created National Congress granted Dinant one of the 1830 honor flags, which were given to 100 cities and towns that played a key role in the revolution. Many of these flags have been lost or destroyed over the past 2 centuries, but Dinant has managed to keep theirs, and it is currently on display in the town hall. Independence wouldn't come that easily, however, as the Dutch king wasn't willing to let Belgium just leave like that, and launched an attack on the secessionist southern provinces in 1831. Many young Dinant men joined the Belgian armed forces to defend the new country from the invading Dutch. However, the attackers' army proved superior, and the Belgian forces were nearly completely annihilated. King Leopold quickly sent emissaries to France and Britain to get military support before Belgium could be taken over by the Dutch again, and the French, in typical fashion for them, couldn't resist the urge for geopolitical influence over the southern Low Countries and immediately sent an army to Belgium. The Dutch had taken a gamble when they had crossed the border, as their allies weren't in a position to help them out militarily, and now that France had gotten involved, had no other option but to retreat back to the Netherlands. And that's how Belgium's independence nearly ended, before it was saved at the last minute by the French of all people. King William would continue to consider Belgium as a rogue state, despite not being able to threaten it militarily. In 1839, the great powers of Europe finally came to an agreement and decided to recognize Belgium's independence, forcing William to finally recognize it as well. And now that everyone's favorite half-Flemish, half-Walloon country that never seems to have a government had been created, Dinant could for the first time in centuries enjoy a prolonged period of peace and stability. Now, Dinant was located in the mainly French and Walloon-speaking Wallonia region of the new federal state of Belgium, and interestingly, Wallonia had been the first region in continental Europe to join the Industrial Revolution, bringing incredible levels of wealth to industrial cities like Liège and Charleroi. Dinant, however, didn't see much of this industrialization, and the town retained a modest and locally oriented economy, with a focus on agriculture, trade along the river, and small local artisanal industry. A completely new type of industry would begin to form in Dinant though, when in 1862, the town was connected to the rest of the continent by rail. This helped the town become more accessible to visitors from the rest of the country who were keen to experience the town's idyllic riverfront and the beautiful collegiate church. Thanks to this, a tourism and hospitality industry began to gradually develop in Dinant. The most important development for the town though was probably the end of its days as a frontier town. For pretty much its entire history, Dinant had been located on the edge of whatever territory it belonged to, whether it was under the United Netherlands, the Prince-Bishopric of Liège, France, or even the Roman Empire, depending on when the town was really founded. The town had never been too far from enemy territory, but with the Treaty of London in 1839, the great European powers had agreed to respect Belgium's independence and neutrality, which meant that, unlike for the past millennia, Dinant no longer sat on a fiercely contested frontier between two rival powers. Additionally, in the 1850s, the town's citadel had become obsolete militarily due to technological advancements in artillery, which resulted in the federal government beginning its disarmament in 1859, with military operations in the fortress ceasing completely in 1867. The fortress was later bought by two private individuals in 1878 and turned into a museum in the early 20th century, which also added to the town's growing tourism industry. Dinant of this time was a quiet and peaceful little town in the Wallonian countryside, with a population of around 7,000 people, a strongly Catholic identity, and a love for their traditional lifestyles. The town's glory days of being a major regional economic hub were nothing but a distant memory of the past at this point, but after 4 centuries of turmoil, the period during the early decades of Belgian independence was certainly a breath of fresh air for Dinant and its citizens. It was also during this period that two of the most famous Dinantais in the town's history, the painter Antoine Vietz and the inventor Adolphe Sax, made their names. Although, funnily enough, neither of them actually lived in the town at this time. Antoine, who had an amazing name by the way, was born in Dinant in 1806, when the town was still a part of the First French Empire. His father was a soldier in Napoleon's army, later becoming a high-ranking officer in the army of the United Netherlands. It was his father who inspired Antoine to do great things with his life, and from a young age he showed a talent for drawing and wood carving, enough so that it secured him a place at the Antwerp Art Academy in 1820 at only the age of 14, and furthermore getting him an annual stipend from the king himself. His career later took him to the French Academy in Rome, before setting up his own studio in Liège and later Brussels. Vietz's art was grandiose, theatrical, and unapologetically romantic, but also eccentric and often unsettling, depicting macabre scenes of death and madness. Unlike many of his contemporaries, who aimed for restrained historical painting, Antoine's aim was to create a spectacle, often around biblical, mythological, or moralizing subjects. To ensure the legacy of his work, Antoine managed to convince the Belgian government to turn his studio in Brussels into a museum for his art, in exchange for donating all of it to the Belgian state. Antoine Vietz died in his studio in 1865 and was embalmed in accordance with ancient Egyptian burial rites, which is pretty metal if you ask me. Today you can visit his old studio turned museum in Brussels to enjoy the art of one of the greatest artists to ever come from Dinant. Now, probably the most famous Dinant in history was no other than Adolf Sax, since even if you haven't heard about him before, you definitely have heard about his most famous invention, the saxophone. Adolf was born in Dinant in 1814, and funnily enough, his real name is Antoine Joseph, meaning that perhaps the two most famous people to ever come out of the town were both called Antoine. Does this really matter? Probably not. Am I biased and just wanted you to know this? Absolutely, although from a very young age, people always tended to refer to him by his nickname Adolf. His father, Charles Joseph, was a Dinant musical instrument maker who, thanks to the town's long history and talent in brass work, was able to specialize in the creation of brass instruments. In 1815, a few months after Adolf's birth, Charles Joseph founded a factory for wind instruments in Brussels, meaning that Adolf didn't actually spend all that much time in Dinant. In Brussels, however, Adolf spent much of his childhood learning the craft of instrument making from his father, which eventually earned him a place at the Royal Conservatory of Brussels in 1828, when he was just about 15 years old, to study flute and clarinet. It didn't take long before the young man started experimenting with new instrument designs, with his first important invention being an improved design for the bass clarinet, which he patented at only the age of 24. He moved to Paris in 1842, where he put his instrument inventing into overdrive. During the 1840s, Sax invented, for example, the saxotrumba, the saxhorn, and the sax tuba, all while driving his saxmobile around town. Okay, that last part didn't actually happen. His most famous invention, though, was finalized in 1846, when he received the patent for the saxophone, intended for use in military bands and orchestras. Although initially enjoying limited popularity within the music circles of Europe, the saxophone eventually grew to become one of the most iconic musical instruments in the popular consciousness. And thanks to his and his family's Dinant origin, he is now one of the biggest points of pride for the town itself. Today there is also a museum in his honor in the town, and saxophone imagery is impossible to miss when visiting Dinant. Even though neither of these men ever actually lived in Dinant past childhood, their lives can still tell us a lot about what the town was like at this time in their history. Both men had upbringings very characteristic to Dinant and its culture. Vietz's father was a soldier stationed at the Dinant citadel, while it's not a coincidence that Sax's family had specialized in instruments specifically made out of brass. I think that the backgrounds of these two can really give us an insight into what it meant to be from Dinant. However, their stories also shine a light on a less flattering side of what the town had become, as both men had to move out of Dinant to make a name for themselves. The centuries following the sacking of the city had left Dinant as a small rural town in the Belgian countryside with limited opportunity for growth. But on the other hand, this period of the town's history was among the most peaceful it had probably ever experienced. This period of peace would come to a shocking and tragic end, however, as the town would find itself among the areas most horrifically affected by the world wars in the 20th century. In 1914, the tensions between the great powers of Europe flared up to the First World War, with Belgium remaining neutral as had been agreed in the Treaty of London in 1839. But despite having agreed to the treaty themselves and upholding it in previous wars, the German Empire was clearly intent on using Belgium to launch its offensive into France. And when Germany invaded Luxembourg on August 2nd, it became clear that Belgium would be next. The British promised military support to Belgium if the country was to be attacked. However, nothing could stop the German invasion, as the Empire's troops crossed the border only 2 days later. The city of Liège was captured in 3 days, after which the Germans started marching on Brussels and the Meuse. Some of the units of the French army, which had also come to assist the Belgians, set themselves into defensive positions in Dinant, occupying the old citadel once more. The Battle of Dinant began on 15th of August, when the German forces started an assault on the town. The French troops in the citadel were quickly overrun by the Germans, forcing them to abandon it and retreat to the town below. The Germans continued their push, which forced the French to retreat even further to the west bank of the river. The Germans then tried to cross the bridge as well, but the French managed to hold them back, even as the Germans in the citadel subjected them to machine gun fire. It was also during this fighting that a certain French lieutenant by the name of Charles de Gaulle was wounded, souring him to the outdated military tactics used by France at the time. But that's a story for another time. Today there's a plaque on the bridge commemorating the place where this happened. Following their defensive victory at the bridge, the French artillery began bombarding the German positions on the east bank, forcing the Germans to retreat this time. By that evening, the French forces had climbed back to the citadel and retaken it. And with this, the first day of the battle was over, and the French retired to more defensible positions on the left bank. The day had led to hundreds of casualties for each side, while at least one Dinant civilian had also been killed. However, things would get a whole lot worse from here. Early next morning, skirmishes took place between the German forces and French patrols. A German detachment took control of the small village of Eu north of Dinant, destroying it and killing several civilians in the process. On the 21st, the Germans were joined by additional divisions of the German Third Army, following which the invaders began preparing for an all-out assault on the town. That same night, a German raiding party mounted in motor vehicles attacked the town, killing many civilians and burning down a dozen houses. They reportedly also threw a hand grenade into a cafe, killing 19. In the dark, things quickly turned chaotic, however, as the Germans began to be fired upon by the defenders. In the confusion, it's possible that the Germans even started firing at each other. Now, it was almost certainly the French night patrols that were the ones that started shooting at the raiding party. However, in a grim turn of events for the Dinantais, the Germans claimed that the townsfolk had used shotguns and revolvers to attack the German troops. And despite there having been no evidence to support this even to this day, and despite the fact that the mayor of Dinant had even asked the citizens not to resist the attackers and to deposit their weapons at the town hall prior to the attack, the German army took this event to brand the town as being full of hostile civilians. Now, this wasn't a simple irrational conclusion made in the heat of the moment, but an outcome of frightening levels of fear-mongering and propaganda the German soldiers had been subjected to by the empire's military leadership. See, during the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, the French government established a force of irregular civilian troops, known as the Francs-Tireurs, who began engaging the Germans using guerrilla tactics, causing many German soldiers to die in ambushes. This really freaked out the German military leadership and popular press, who began a multi-decade-long propaganda and fear-mongering campaign to vilify the Francs-Tireurs in the German popular consciousness. And already in the Franco-Prussian War, this caused the German armies to commit numerous massacres and atrocities against innocent French civilians to pacify the Francs-Tireurs. But by the First World War, the 4 decades of propaganda had caused the German soldiers fighting in the war to develop a harrowing fear of the Francs-Tireurs and a deep distrust of civilian populations. So then, it should be no surprise that when the invasion of Belgium began in early August, the German media quickly began to link the Belgian civilians with the Francs-Tireurs. The German soldiers attacking Dinant would have all been familiar with the propaganda pushed by the military leadership and the media, and this, along with the fact that the echoes created by the hilly terrain of Dinant made it difficult to identify where gunfire was coming from, made the German soldiers only more paranoid of civilian guerrillas. So when events like the night raid happened, it did not take a lot of convincing or factual evidence to make the German army believe that they were fighting a force of Francs-Tireurs. And the Germans were quite open about their intentions to pacify the town's civilian population. A German captain reportedly even told the local priest that tomorrow Dinant will be burned and killed. We have lost too many men. And it was in this context that one of the darkest days in the town's history began. In the early morning of August 23rd, the German artillery began bombarding the town, while the German infantry began advancing on the town from the north and the south. The French started firing at the advancing Germans. However, the paranoid imperial troops once again blamed the civilians for firing at them. From here, the German soldiers began indiscriminately executing civilians in their masses, lining them up against the wall to be executed, throwing grenades into their houses, and by plain shooting them on the spot. The survivors of these massacres would later say that the Germans had known that most of the civilians had been innocent, but considered them collectively responsible for the actions of the alleged Francs-Tireurs, and therefore decided to conduct the massacres as collective punishment against the whole town. These massacres spread further when the German forces in the south crossed the river in the Nef, which included killing 23 civilians hiding under a railway viaduct. By the end of the day, hundreds of civilians, including men, women, and children, the youngest being only a few months old, had been murdered by the German soldiers, and the killings would only continue, as the next day, the Germans moved on to the rest of the town center and began systematically burning it down, looting and damaging historical buildings like the collegiate church and the town hall. The German forces in the north also managed to cross the river into Bobigny, where they began to similarly execute civilians. Astier, a town upstream from Dinant, also suffered a similar fate. The French, on the other hand, were forced to retreat as the Germans continued their advance. By the end of the battle, a total of around 677 civilians from Dinant and the surrounding villages had been murdered in cold blood by the German forces. An additional 400 civilians were imprisoned and deported to Germany, and in the end, around 1,200 houses had been burnt down. The events of the 23rd and the 24th of August, now known as the Massacre of Dinant, were met with widespread outrage around the globe. However, the town wasn't the only one to suffer such a fate, as the German troops carried out similar systematic massacres of civilians in countless other towns as their armies advanced through Belgium, although the Massacre of Dinant was among the largest in total casualties. By the end of the war, the Germans had been responsible for the deaths of around 24,000 civilians, with 6,000 having been murdered outright and further 18,000 dying from imprisonment. And this isn't taking into account all those among the living whose lives had been completely upended, including around 18,000 orphaned children. These atrocities were collectively named the of Belgium by the American and British media, and as a response to all the global condemnation, the German Empire published the so-called German White Book, which aimed to absolve the army by once again claiming that the German troops had only tried to defend themselves from the aggressive civilians. The White Book, however, was received with a heavy amount of skepticism from the global community, like you would expect. The Bishop of Namur at the time, for his own part, replied with quite an invigorated put-down of the Germans' attempt at whitewashing their actions. We are only waiting for the moment when the impartial historian can come to Dinant, see for themselves what happened there, and interview the survivors. There are enough of them left to reconstruct all the facts in their truth and sincerity. Then it will become clear that there has never been a time when the innocence of the victims has been more clearly demonstrated, and the guilt of the perpetrators more obvious. Events will resolve themselves in the unleashing, with an army of a cruelty as useless as it is inexplicable. Then the universe, which has already judged with extreme and just rigor the massacre of nearly 700 civilians and the destruction of an ancient city, with its monuments, archives, and industries, will appreciate with even greater severity this new procedure which, to clear itself of a deserved accusation, stops at nothing and transforms unjustly sacrificed victims into assassins. As for Dinant, after 448 years, the town had once again been taken over by a grim yet familiar sight, as the streets were filled with decomposing corpses, with the town's houses continuing to burn for days following the massacre. Things wouldn't get any better from here though, as the town would be occupied by the German Empire for the next 4 years. Unlike many other towns where life returned to somewhat regular, although a very oppressive routine, Dinant's inhabitants were left to survive in an uninhabitable wasteland. No rebuilding of the town would commence before the end of the war, leaving the survivors to live in cellars and the few badly damaged structures that were still left standing. Many Dinantais had fled the town either before or during the battle, leaving Dinant practically a ghost town. The remaining citizens had to live in constant fear of reprisal from the German patrols, who used the alleged civilian resistance during the battle as a justification to impose harsh curfews and restrictions on the townsfolk. Hunger and disease was common in the town, as much of the food, livestock, and material was seized by the occupiers, although the American Commission for Relief in Belgium helped the Dinantais out somewhat, as they arranged for the supply of food to the German-occupied Belgium. The occupation of the town would come to an end on November 11, 1918, when the German Empire finally surrendered to the Allies after 4 bloody years of fighting. In Dinant though, the end of the war didn't bring much cheer to the population, as the town remained in ruins, and the townsfolk had been inflicted with irreversible trauma. With the German occupation gone, the citizens would begin to slowly rebuild the town, as refugees and deported civilians began returning to Dinant. Over the next decade, destroyed neighborhoods were rebuilt, historical buildings like the Collegiate Church and the Town Hall were repaired, and monuments were erected to commemorate the victims of the massacre. In Belgium and abroad, Dinant gained a reputation as a martyred town, with the president of the French Chamber of Deputies, for example, coming to the town to honor the victims on the massacre's 5-year anniversary in 1919. The town's economy began to slowly recover, and the tourism industry that had begun to take shape before the war returned, as many Belgians came not only to experience the dramatic scenery of the riverfront, but to pay respects to the martyrs of Dinant. Following the war, the Allies came up with the, at the time, unheard of idea of putting the leaders of the losing army on trial for war crimes, and forced Germany to hold a set of trials for a list of German generals and other officers known as the Leipzig trials. However, for a variety of reasons that I won't go into here, these trials were mostly a failure, among others leading to all of those responsible for the massacre in Dinant to walk free. Worse yet, the town and the country was hit by the Great Depression in 1929, throwing a massive wrench in the economic recovery of Dinant. The economic instability and high unemployment then led to the spread of radical political movements and ideas in Belgium, following a broader European trend at the time. By the end of the 1930s, however, Belgium had managed to reverse the trend, and the country, along with Dinant, were set to move towards a more stable economy and political landscape in the near future. Unfortunately, the future would have different plans. In the 20 years following the Great War, the town had barely managed to begin recovering when Europe was swept over by the shadow of yet another looming great power conflict. Germany, humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles following their defeat in the war, had quickly begun to remilitarize in the 1930s and adopted an increasingly expansionist foreign policy. This naturally worried the Belgians, and especially the Dinantais, who had no appetite for another war in their country. In response, King Leopold III announced that Belgium would remain neutral in the event of a major conflict and left all the alliances it had joined following the previous war. He also got a guarantee of neutrality from the German government, and, well, we all know how much that was worth. Belgium also began construction and modernization of fortifications around the country, and especially on the border with Germany, in the hopes of pulling a Switzerland if a new war was to begin. And when the war finally came, as Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Belgium quickly began general mobilization, drafting around 20% of the country's male population, including many young men from Dinant. Unfortunately, however, Germany had no actual interest in guaranteeing Belgian neutrality and made preparations for an invasion, which began on the 10th of May 1940, as German tanks rolled into the countries of Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. The Allies and Belgium hoped to halt the German advance using the country's new fortifications. However, this strategy failed miserably, as the Germans managed to break through Belgium's first defensive line within just 2 days. This triggered a panic among Belgian civilians, and especially the Dinantais, who, remembering the atrocities of 1914, left their homes and began fleeing towards the west. The French and the Belgians sought to establish a part of its new defensive line on the Meuse River, occupying the left bank of the river. The defenders destroyed all the bridges crossing the river before the Germans arrived on the 12th of May. German forces once again took over the town, while under heavy fire from the French. This time, however, the invaders found the town abandoned. The next day, the Germans began crossing the river on inflatable boats, taking heavy casualties under a barrage of gunfire from the defenders. The French fought heroically, but couldn't stop the Germans from establishing a bridgehead on the left bank of the Meuse, and as the invaders managed to achieve similar feats at other strategic points on the river to the south, the French forces had to retreat to avoid encirclement. And so, the Germans had once again conquered Dinant, although this time the bloodshed of civilians had been avoided. It would take just 2 weeks before King Leopold announced Belgium's unconditional surrender to Germany, bringing the country under German occupation for another 4 years. The Dinantais refugees, having nowhere else to go, returned to their homes to face another military occupation, less than 22 years after the end of the last one. Although this time the town wasn't left in ruins, the citizens faced similar harsh curfews, hunger, and fear of violent reprisal from the patrolling troops as during the First World War. The population was tightly surveilled, with German propaganda filling the streets. The Germans also took upon themselves to destroy every single monument of remembrance to the 1914 massacre, as to them they were anti-German propaganda. Initially, most people would have kept their heads down and tried to stay out of trouble to survive the occupation, while small minorities of civilians either collaborated with the occupiers or joined the clandestine Belgian resistance against them. However, as the German oppression grew stricter, like by forcing civilians to serve in labor programs in Germany, and as the Germans started to face setbacks, like the failure to capture Great Britain, more and more people began taking part in the resistance. The most common form was passive resistance, like listening to prohibited radio shows, reading and distributing underground newspapers, or being deliberately inefficient at work. A smaller group took part in active resistance, like sabotaging useful infrastructure, intercepting letters, or even spying for the Allies. As a small provincial town, Dinant at the time had a small Jewish community, likely consisting only of a few families. In many parts of Belgium, the resistance helped Jewish families hide from the occupiers. However, in Dinant, it's hard to know if this was the case. It's likely that most, if not all, were deported to Germany between 1942 and 1944. The turning point for Dinant and Belgium came on the 6th of June 1944, when the Allies launched their invasion of continental Europe at Normandy. The landing force managed to defeat the Germans on the beach, allowing for further operations deeper into France and the rest of Europe. All of a sudden, membership in active resistance against the Germans began growing exponentially, as the so-called resistors of the 11th hour realized that the Allies had the Germans on the back foot, and it only took a few months before Allied forces had reached the Belgian border, and within 4 days from that, Brussels had been liberated from the Germans. Dinant didn't see any significant battle this time, however the town was partially damaged by Allied bombers and the retreating Germans. The American troops passing through the area reportedly nicknamed the region the Colorado of Belgium due to its hilly terrain. However, this wouldn't be the end of the war in Belgium, as the Germans made a surprise attack on the Allied forces in mid-December in what became known as the Battle of the Bulge. The German forces began quickly advancing towards Dinant with the aim of recapturing the Meuse in a few days. The town only narrowly avoided another battle, as the Allied forces managed to stop the German advance at the village of Feu-Notre-Dame, just a mere 5 kilometers from Dinant. From here, the Allies on the Western Front began pushing the Germans back, invading Germany the following year, leading to the surrender of Germany and the end of the Second World War in Europe. For the past nearly 500 years following the siege in 1466, the town had gone through a period of nearly constant war, with 7 known battles and sieges taking place in Dinant during that time. The centuries had taken their toll on the once mighty European trade city, which was once again faced with a tough revitalization project following yet another occupation. This time, things were starting to look different though. The creation of the nuclear bomb, as well as international organizations like the United Nations, NATO, and the European Union, has meant that no war has been fought on Belgian soil since the Second World War. The year 2028 will, hopefully, mark the longest period of peace in the country as well as Dinant since at least the early Middle Ages, as that title is currently held by the period between the 10 Days Campaign in 1831 and the First World War in 1914. This extended period of peace has allowed Dinant to flourish once more in the 8 decades following its liberation by the Allies. Initially, the recovery was slow, as rationing and food shortages continued into the late 1940s. The quality of life in Dinant and Belgium then began to rapidly increase thanks to the post-war Belgian economic miracle and the American financial aid received through the Marshall Plan. Many of the monuments of remembrance for the 1914 massacre were rebuilt, and the town's houses and public buildings were repaired in a mix of restored traditional styles and more utilitarian post-war architecture. From the 1950s onwards, Dinant began rebuilding its tourism industry, drawing visitors for its dramatic riverside scenery, beautiful town streets, and impressive cultural sites like the Collegiate Church and the Citadel. The town also began to increasingly promote its link to the famous Adolf Sax, with more and more saxophone imagery, museums, and related events becoming prominent in the townscape. During the 1960s and 70s, the town began growing physically as well, as many of the surrounding municipalities began to be merged with Dinant. Most notably, in 1965, the town's ancient rival of Bouvigny was annexed into Dinant, meaning that Dinant had finally come out victorious centuries after the rivalry had stopped being relevant, which I'm sure was celebrated accordingly in the town. In 2001, almost 87 years after the town's infamous massacre, the German government finally made an official apology to Dinant when the Secretary of State for Defense, Walter Kolbu, made a visit to the town to make amends for the atrocities committed by the German military. The town naturally couldn't accept the apology on behalf of the deceased, but the act still marked a symbolic moment for Dinant and its place in an ever more interconnected Europe. On August 23, 2014, to commemorate the centennial of the massacre, a new memorial was put up on the left bank with a complete list of the 674 known victims of those 2 fateful days in 1914. But to end this section on Dinant's history on a more lighthearted note, in 2013, the town became the first official twin city of Disneyland Paris. Yes, the theme park. See, in 2012, to celebrate the 20th anniversary of Disneyland Paris, the town held a sand sculpture festival themed around Disney. As a token of gratitude, and thanks to the fact that Dinant kinda looks like a scene from a Disney movie, the theme park made an agreement with the town of twinning the 2 locations, with Mickey Mouse coming to visit Dinant, and even being made an honorary citizen. In return, a delegation from the town made an official visit to the theme park, and today the town halls of both places hold a commemorative plaque to honor the event. Honestly, this is one of the most random turn of events I've had the chance to discuss on this channel, and I love it. Dinant is a town that has definitely had one roller coaster ride of a history, enjoying some of the highest ups and some of the lowest lows that you'd be hard pressed to try and find a match for. Once one of the most famous cities in Europe for its brasswork industry, fiercely proud and independent, the city's downfall came with the gradual transition from the highly localized European feudal system towards a more centralized system of nation-states. The Dukes of Burgundy might have sought to, and for a time succeeded to wipe Dinant off the face of the earth, but on the other hand, here's Dinant, looking as beautiful as ever. Meanwhile, their Burgundian state fell apart within 2 generations. This town's history has oftentimes been quite heartbreaking, the townsfolk having suffered multiple tragedies along the way. Yet somehow, the Dinantais have always come back to rebuild and restore their traditions. Today, if you ever come to visit Dinant, you'll find a beautiful, quiet little riverside town with an immense pride for its own history. From beautiful churches to museums celebrating the town's military history, famous citizens, and one of the most famous beer brands in the world, and from saxophone-themed music festivals to bakeries serving the town's traditional biscuits and workshops that to this day continue the town's millennia-old tradition in brass craftsmanship, a deep connection to history and an appreciation for past generations is never too far in Dinant. And dare I say, there has never been a better time to grab yourself a coupe de Dinant, sit by the river and enjoy a view that impressed even Mickey Mouse himself. But now that we know the history of this beautiful little town, let's see what it feels like to visit today. Or, well, these clips are from 2023, so more like what it was like 2 years ago, but whatever. Now, chances are that you have never heard of Dinant before this video, and I'm gonna be completely honest and tell you that neither had I before I decided to go here back when I did this trip in 2023. So why did I decide to pick this little town of all the places in Belgium? Well, let me tell you, the main reason for my trip was to visit Luxembourg, as you've hopefully seen in my previous video, but since my flights both arrived in and departed from Brussels, I wanted to take the opportunity to explore a couple places in Belgium as well. Now, I had already been to the Flanders region and the capital Brussels a few years prior, but I had yet to visit the Wallonia region of the country, so I decided to do just that as the second half of my trip. Now, unfortunately for me, most of the famous cities in Belgium are located in Flanders, leaving my knowledge of Wallonia severely lacking. And in my absence of prior knowledge, I decided to do the next best thing and just ask Google. So the week before my trip, I had to plan this on a short notice, don't ask me why, I spent some time going through top 10 lists for places to visit in Wallonia, and it didn't take a whole lot of convincing for me to choose Dinant as one of my destinations, since as soon as I saw these pictures, I was already sold. Now, was choosing a place to spend my time and money traveling to based on 2 pictures on the internet a good idea? Absolutely, and now I'm gonna tell you why. After having spent a few days in the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg, I left from the central railway station early in the morning on this cold day in mid-October. The train ride took 2.5 hours, with a quick connection in the town of Libremont, after which I finally arrived in the little town that I had only learned about the previous week. The train station is just a short walk from the town's famous riverfront, and on the way there you get familiar with the vibe of the town. However, once you get to the riverfront, I can tell you that it definitely lives up to its reputation, as the combination of the river and the colorful townhouses, with the backdrop of the church, the citadel, and the steep hills creates a truly magical vista. I could spend hours here just admiring every little detail of the scenery, so it's not hard to see why the town has been a favorite for tourists for nearly 2 centuries at this point. I kinda wanna just keep talking, so I can show you more of the clips I took of this place, but honestly, all I can say is just look at it. Very pretty. Now, the river of course can be crossed via the Charles de Gaulle Bridge, named in honor of the French president as he took part in the Battle of Dinant during the First World War. They even have a statue in his honor next to the bridge. Today, the bridge is decorated with these sculptures of saxophones representing different countries around the world, alongside the flag of the respective country. Saxophone imagery is actually quite common throughout the town, as Dinant was the birthplace of Adolphe Sax, the man who invented the saxophone, although it doesn't seem he ever actually lived in the town as an adult. Standing on the bridge also allows you to get some good views of the Meuse and the townhouses on the opposing banks of the river. I then reached the other side of the river, not that it was difficult or anything, but factually speaking I did do that. This eastern bank is where the town was founded and thus has served as its center for over a millennia. As such, this part of the town also includes most of the important historical buildings and attractions. One such building is of course the Collegiate Church of Our Lady, located right at the western end of the bridge. This absolutely gorgeous building is a prime example of 13th century Gothic architecture with its ornate design and flying buttresses. But that's not all, as in the 16th century the Dinantais decided to add this pear-shaped bell tower to the building, giving it its now iconic and unique facade. The church is quite imposing and clearly stands out in the town skyline. Inside you can admire the stunning artwork, stained glass windows, and this bust containing the relics of Saint Perpète, the patron saint of Dinant. In real life, the church is just awe-inspiring, especially with the promontory in the backdrop, making it one of the most uniquely fairy tale-like locations I've ever gotten to visit. Now, of course, one of, if not the most important location in the town is the citadel atop the promontory. The views from this place are a big part of the reason why I decided to come to Dinant in the first place, since if you watched my previous video about Luxembourg City, you know that I love a good view. You can get to the citadel from the entrance right next to the Collegiate Church, where you can either take the cable car up to the promontory or do what I decided to do and take the fun route and take the 408-step staircase up to the citadel. Now be warned that these stairs, first built in the 1500s, are in fact quite steep. But on the other hand, the climb is an experience in and of itself, as you get some exercise while also feeling a growing sense of accomplishment as you progress up the hill, with the views getting better with every step you take. Eventually, you'll make it to a little platform on the side of the citadel, where you get to enjoy for the first time some incredible views of the town and the Meuse River without the obstruction of buildings and trees. They also have this telescope that's free to use, in case you want to take a closer look at anything. The town and the surrounding valley are absolutely stunning, and this is one of the best places in Dinant to see them. But now let's move on to the actual citadel itself. Although this current version of the citadel was mainly built by the Dutch in the early 1800s, this site has been home to some form of fortifications for at least the past nearly 1000 years, if not even longer. Militarily, the fortress fell out of use around the 1850s and has since been turned into a museum. Today the citadel holds exhibits of all sorts relating to the history of the town, like this 18th century map of Dinant, this guillotine replica from around the same period, this recreation of the dungeons from the middle of the 19th century, all sorts of historical weaponry, and this whirlpool. This whirlpool was actually used by French soldiers stationed in Dinant in the early 1900s. Pierre, taxidermied here, is the operator of the Great Whirlpool of Dinant. He sure looks like he's having the time of his life, but he is actually extremely stressed. See, Pierre is suspicious that one of his comrades is actually a German spy. Lucas, who looks like he just realized he left his car keys at home, already knows he's being caught, because he doesn't have a French mustache. Anyway, you can also experience a bit of what everyday life in the town would have been like throughout history, with this recreation of a medieval forge, linking back to Dinant's history as a center for brasswork in medieval Europe, this kitchen and bakery from the early modern period, and these barracks for the soldiers stationed at the citadel. The hallways of the citadel are filled with embrasures for guns, allowing for a small peek into the lives of the soldiers who would have looked out of these holes to keep an eye on the town and the valley below. The fortress also has a little courtyard where you can chill out and admire replicas of artillery from the 18th century. Next to the citadel is a cafe where you can get some more excellent views of the town. This is where your cable car will arrive if you choose not to walk up the stairs. And this location is probably the best place to see the citadel itself. This vantage point definitely drives home why the citadel was chosen to be built exactly here of all places. And what's pretty cool about this cafe is that it also includes a decommissioned British World War II era fighter jet just casually next to the dining area. But before I left, I went back to the citadel, where there is another viewing platform at the tip of the fortress, and in my humble opinion, this is the best place to view the town. From here you get a nearly perfect 270-degree view of Dinant, the river and the valley, allowing you to see pretty much all of Dinant from one location. In my official AntonTheKicker viewpoint ranking, this spot takes 3rd place in the viewpoints visited so far in this series. Following my tour of the citadel, it was time to descend back to street level. This time I took the cable car though, because taking the fun route twice would be a little too much fun. Yeah, that's why. At this point, I'd like to talk about the town itself, because just as much as the citadel, the church, and the river, the townscape of Dinant is also a major attraction of the town. Honestly, one of my favorite things to do in Dinant is to just wander around the streets and admire the townhouses and the various historical buildings against the backdrop of the hills and the citadel. This town is just so pretty, and walking around is a great way to discover endless amounts of quiet little streets and alleys filled with aesthetically beautiful architecture. Some important sites around the town that you could encounter while walking around include the town hall and the Dinant courthouse just south of the citadel, and the Adolphe Sax house, a museum dedicated to the inventor of the saxophone, which you can find just down the street from the collegiate church. In front of the building, they have a statue of the man himself chilling on a bench with his saxophone. Imagery of Adolphe Sax can be found all over the town, and I really mean all over the town. They really love this guy. And it's not just Dinant, as Belgium also had his likeness in the 200 franc note before adopting the euro. There's also this monument to Adolphe Sax in the square next to the museum, which is less conventional, but I think that's pretty cool. And of course, there's some saxophones as well. Walking around the town, you'll also encounter dozens of different artworks that aren't related to sax and the saxophone, believe it or not. Unfortunately, my visit to this beautiful little spot in the world proved to be quite short, as I had to catch another train to my next destination, as I was going to stay the night there. Dinant definitely is an amazing day trip destination, but if I ever came back, I'd probably choose to stay for at least a few days, as there were so many things I didn't get to see, like the Rocher Ballard, the standalone rock that was created when the French occupational forces wanted to carve a path through the promontory in the 1600s. There's also of course the Lef Abbey, which has been a center for monastic life in the town for the better part of the last 1000 years, and the Maison Lef, which is a museum for the beer brand Lef that originates from the abbey. A short distance from the town center itself, you also also have some very interesting locations to visit. You could go to Bovigny, for example, which is now within the town limits of Dinant, but in the Middle Ages was the town's most dreaded rival, which includes its own citadel and a central church. There are also so many cool castles just a short drive from Dinant, namely the Walson Castle and the Veuve Castle, both around a 15-minute drive south of the town center. Now, if you decide to go to Dinant, it's absolutely imperative that you try the town's traditional Coupe de Dinant as well. Wait a minute, I didn't try the Coupe de Dinant when I was there. So yeah, I didn't try the Coupe de Dinant because, to be honest, I didn't realize how important they were, since when I actually went to Dinant, that was almost 2 years ago now, and I only now just managed to finish the script, so I just didn't realize how important they were. So when I did see them, I just kind of walked past them and I was like, hey, cool cookies. And I didn't try any of them because, to be fair, they are quite expensive. At a bakery, they're like 5 euros a pop at least. So I did end up going all the way to Dinant, and I didn't try the cookies. But we're gonna do the next best thing, and I have these things here with me today, and we're gonna cook them ourselves. So fortunately, the recipe for the Coupe de Dinant is very simple, which is very good for me because I don't really bake a lot. In fact, the entire thing only has 2 ingredients. The Coupe de Dinant is 50% honey, or hunaja, and 50% flour, or vehnejajo. I don't know why am I saying it like that, it's vehneja. So hopefully the recipe is so simple that even I can't mess it up. And because I'm feeling adventurous, we also have some sugar here, or sokeri, and we're gonna make coupe de reine. I don't know how to say that.
Coupe de Reims.
We're gonna make coupe de reims, which incorporates some amount of sugar. I'm not sure how much, so I'm just gonna... So anyway, now that that's been cleaned up, we're also gonna try coupe de reims, which incorporates some amount of sugar. I'm not sure how much because I couldn't find exact numbers anywhere, so I'm just gonna eyeball it. And yeah, let's bake some cookies. So I started by putting an equal amount of honey and flour by weight into a bowl, and then mixing it until the mixture turned into this nice goldish brown color. At this point I decided to split the dough into 2 and use the other one to make coupes de reims. You do this by adding sugar into the dough and then mixing it, obviously. And now that this was done, I placed the pieces of dough on a baking tray and pressed them into the shape of a cookie. Yes, this is the best I could do. Next, I put it into the oven at 300 degrees Celsius. Please ignore the fact that the lights don't work. I let them stay there for about 10 minutes, after which I took them out and let them cool down in the fridge overnight. So it's the day after now. I let the cookies cool down over the night, and here they are. Now I'm gonna be honest, I still messed it up. Even though this was supposed to be like super easy. This is supposed to be hard, but as you can see, so I would take anything I say about these once I do a taste test with a grain of salt, because these aren't really like proper coupes de Dinant, but you know, I'd assume the taste is mostly the same. So yeah, let's do a little taste test. So this one is a coupe de Dinant. This is a classic one, even though it's not being done properly. And then we also have a coupe de reims, which adds sugar into the mix, which makes it more, well, usually it makes it softer, but with this one, this is like, these are basically the same now. But yeah, I'll do a taste test. That's actually tough. I mean, I like it. It tastes like flour and honey. This is such a bad review. This is not a review because I did not do this correctly. I mean, it's alright, but it's just not correct, is it? If I ever go back to Dinant, I'll post a proper review of one of these when they're like properly done, not like this. But yeah, I think that's okay. It's kind of hard to make any statements about the recipe when I just completely butchered it. But yeah, here's a coupe de reims. This looks very good actually, and it's got a lot of sugar, so it should be quite sweet. That is very good. That's very good. I like this more than this, but also you can't really count this. So, but yeah, this has been the worst baking show of all time, and also the worst review. So I guess you're just gonna have to go to Dinant and try them for yourself. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching this video. This has been a passion project of mine for the past couple months, and I'm so glad I'm able to bring it out to you finally. So if you haven't seen the previous episode about Luxembourg, I would recommend you watch that next. And also, if you're interested, all my Patreon members and YouTube members will also get shouted out at the end of these videos as well. But thank you again so much for watching this video. If you've made it this far, you're honestly a legend. I really hope you enjoyed this video. I'll see you guys next time. I'm not gonna be a baker, am I? The town held a sand sculpture festival themed around Messi. Not Messi. They have a statue of the man himself chilling on the beach. The beach? Don't touch the table. So yeah.